This time will become but a small moment in life's scheme of things.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is my first time to Mountain View. And it's good to be here. I need to start asking. I think I probably have several Mountain View graduates at UNT. So y'all keep doing a good job. And keep sending them up our way. All right, so this is a Women's History Month talk. What does a white middle-aged guy know about African American women's history? That's a fair question to ask. I imagine some of you are wondering it right now. I'm a historian of the Civil Rights Movement. This is something I've been interested in since I was younger than you are, since I was a teenager. And so I've been studying it for close to 30 years now. And the more I studied it, the more I kept hearing about this woman, Ella Baker, who I never learned about in my history classes in high school or college. I didn't learn about her until I was in graduate school, but I kept hearing about this woman whose ideas were so important to so many different civil rights organizations. And I wanted to know more about her. So I came to this problem as someone who was interested in the ideas that motivated the civil rights movement. And that's the kind of book that I've written about Ella Baker. And I'd like to talk about those ideas today and why they're so important to the civil rights movement. Now, before I start, how many of you had even heard of Ella Baker before today? Or before you saw the flyer for today's program? No one? One person had heard of Ella Baker. All right. Well, I hope I'm gonna allow you to leave the room today with a deeper understanding of who she was and why she was important to the civil rights movement, why those ideas that we're talking about were so critical to the successes that the civil rights movement enjoyed. And I'm going to try to convince you that by studying Ms. Baker and her ideas, we can discover what gave the civil rights movement its most important and its most enduring intellectual force. I'm going to try to convince you that her ideas are just as important for us today, just as timely as they've ever been. And I'm going to try to convince you that the claim I've made in the subtitle of this talk isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. Mrs. Baker invented the civil rights movement. She at least invented the mass movement of the civil rights movement that gave it its power. You can tell me at the end of the talk whether or not I've succeeded in convincing you of that, but that's what I'm going to try to do today. Baker expressed ideas that I've called the paradox of egalitarian leadership. She wanted leaders of the civil rights movement to elevate other people, right? Not to be elevated themselves. She wanted egalitarian leadership, which it sounds like a contradiction in terms. But that's what she pushed for, and the groups that were most successful in putting her ideas into practice are the ones that created the most change as part of America's civil rights movement. She insisted that civil rights movements would be more healthy, would accomplish more substantive long-term changes if they worked to empower entire communities of people instead of elevating charismatic leaders, right? But who do the news media cover? Who do the newspaper reporters interview when it comes to civil rights protests? The face of the organization, right? The spokesman, the person out there giving the speeches, right? It tends to be male, right? Historians tend to do the same thing. We tend to elevate the people who were out there making the speeches and who were most eloquent. That's who we remember collectively, right? In contrast, Ms. Baker talked the talk and walked the walk of group-centered leadership, this term that she had for what civil rights movements should aspire to. Group-centered leadership rather than groups elevating a charismatic leader, right? Giving the group the skills of leadership that would be necessary to push forward. There's another big reason why most of us in the room have never heard of Ms. Baker before today, and it also points out many of the limits that the national civil rights movement of the post-World War II period faced. It's plain and simple good old-fashioned sexism, right? Powerful men in the civil rights movement ignored Baker's ideas in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s simply because they didn't like having to listen to strong-willed women. They weren't used to doing it, and they weren't about to start. We have to admit that this was the case even with male civil rights leaders whom we might otherwise greatly admire. And Dr. King is one of those men. So how different would the history of the civil rights movement look if we placed women at its center? How would we have to adjust our own ideas about who led and who made up the movement? Our ideas about what they tried to do and about what they accomplished. We can explore these questions through a biography of Ms. Baker, because she was the only person, male or female, to have had a leadership role in all of the three major civil rights organizations of the mid-20th century, the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. To understand how significant the changes were that Ms. Baker did so much to bring about, let's rewind a little bit and think about the big picture of what she and her compatriots accomplished. If you go back to the middle decades of the 20th century, the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, a mass movement of African Americans came together, a group of people who had very little economic power and no political power, right? They came together and they transformed a system that oppressed them, right? How did they do that? In those years, the overwhelming majority of African Americans lived in the southern states where white supremacy was codified in Jim Crow law. It was ingrained in social custom. It was enforced with absolutely horrific amounts of violence on the part of individual citizens and on the part of representatives of state and local governments. Without any voting power whatsoever and without any collective economic power, they had no reliable allies in state and local governments and very, very few in the national government. So black citizens had to work without government protection or a realistic expectation of access to equal justice under the law. Yet somehow they did combine the one power that they did have, people power, right? The power of ordinary, normal people working together in concert to transform the United States. The social movement that they put together, the civil rights movement, was inarguably the best and brightest display of democratic social change ever seen in the United States of America. And in retrospect, it seems almost impossible that this minority of Americans who were so thoroughly marginalized, so thoroughly exploited by the majority, first of all, could have had enough faith in American institutions that they literally risked their own lives to reform those institutions, not just for themselves, but for all Americans. And that's important to remember, right? The civil rights movement that African Americans fought in the mid-20th century wasn't just for their own rights. It was for the rights of all Americans, right? So number one, they would have enough faith in American institutions that they would make those sacrifices. It was even more unlikely that they could have succeeded when they tried to do that, but succeed they did, using no more, no less than the collective power of ordinary people working in solidarity. Keep that in mind. Right? The only weapons they had in their arsenal were the belief that they deserved better. Right? They were living lives that, under a system that oppressed them, and they thought they deserved better. They had that weapon, and they had the weapon of solidarity. Right? This commitment to one another as they tried to get that something better. That's all they had. Ella Baker showed them how to maximize those resources. Okay? She's not the only person responsible for the success of the civil rights movement. And at some level, arguing about who's successful or most successful or who the top three were or whatever argument you have, at some level that's silly. Right? Of course Martin Luther King was largely responsible for this. Of course Ms. Baker was largely responsible for this. We can go down the list. The multiple black freedom struggles we know as the collective civil rights movement was a stew with hundreds of ingredients and thousands of cooks. There were lots of people who played a part in this success. But with the exception of a small handful of people that includes the movement's most charismatic and effective spokesperson, Dr. King, no one person, not a president, not a politician, not a cultural figure, not a religious figure, could claim more credit for the development of the mass movement or the changes that it brought about than Ella Josephine Baker could have claimed if that's what she was about. But that's not what she was about. She wasn't about claiming credit. And she believed that the worst thing that could happen to someone working for social change was for that person to attract the attention of mass media, right? And to begin playing to the cameras, right? To go out and make speeches that they knew would be picked up by the New York Times and the National Broadcasting Company and everyone else. She felt like that was absolutely the worst thing that someone engaged in social change could get involved with, so she refused to do it. But her reticence in front of the cameras only begins to explain why Baker did not become the sort of national figure that other civil rights leaders became in her lifetime. She didn't seek publicity for herself. The major news outlets seldom sought her out for comment, but that made little difference to her. When she reflected back on her long career at the end of her life, she said, "You didn't see me on television. You didn't see news stories about me. The kind of role that I tried to play was to pick up pieces or put pieces together, out of which I hoped organization might come. My theory is strong people don't need strong leaders." Okay, let's think about that for a second. Strong people don't need strong leaders. If that's the case, then the civil rights movement that she helped create wasn't about creating the sorts of leaders that we're familiar with, right? And it certainly wasn't about teaching people how to go out and make beautiful speeches or to give eloquent interviews to newspaper reporters, right? It was about creating strong people, helping communities create strong institutions that they themselves could control, right? Giving the tools that they needed to determine their own fates instead of waiting for a great leader to come in and save the day, right? So in studying Baker, it forces us to rethink what leadership really amounted to, right? Stokely Carmichael, an activist and community organizer in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, who went on to become chairman of the organization, believed, quote, "The most powerful person in the struggle of the 60s was Miss Ella Baker, not Martin Luther King." He was exaggerating for effect when he said that. It wasn't the first time or the last time he made that kind of exaggeration. But the fact remains that over a long career, Baker would wield tremendous influence over a generation of social activists, even if she was largely invisible to the society around her at the time, and even if she remains largely unknown today. As I said at the beginning, Baker held leadership positions in the three major civil rights organizations of her day. She was the only person to hold leadership positions in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. No one besides Baker influenced all three, and no one had as long a career working for the civil rights of African Americans as Baker did. She developed a sophisticated philosophy of civil rights activism that she described memorably as group-centered leadership, which remade the Black freedom struggle in the 1960s and continues to inform activists for social justice and equality in the 21st century. Avoiding the charismatic leadership and the headline-grabbing mobilizing campaigns that drew so much attention to the civil rights struggle in Birmingham and Selma, the March on Washington, among other places, Baker came to preach and practice a much more long-term and intensely egalitarian gospel of community organizing. This organizing tradition, according to the historian Charles Payne, requires, quote, "a different sense of what freedom means, and therefore a greater emphasis on the long-term development of leadership in ordinary men and women." Baker developed a commitment to this kind of long-term development because, according to Payne, she had faith that ordinary people who learn to believe in themselves are capable of extraordinary acts, or better, of acts that seem extraordinary to us precisely because we have such an impoverished sense of the capabilities of ordinary people. Baker said you must let oppressed people define their own freedom. You must let the oppressed define their own freedom. And she believed that all people have the right to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. These are very simple statements, right? Perhaps they seem second nature to us, right? You have to allow the oppressed to define their own freedom. And you have to allow people to participate in the decisions that affect people's lives. But if you take them to their logical extremes, and if you really walk that walk, that has radical consequences, right? You can think of examples in your own life in which you're not really given a voice in the decisions that affect your life, right? People in your community don't have entire control over the community, right? Don't get to make those decisions that affect them. If we take these sentiments to the logical extreme, they can have radical consequences. Baker's concept of leadership differed greatly from the concept that most Americans held during her time, and that differs from our concept today. To understand it, we have to forget what most of us think we know about the qualities of an effective leader, because Baker believed that leaders should first and foremost be facilitators or teachers. Strong speaking skills were helpful, right? You have to have someone who can get out there and give the eloquent speech that sums up all of your goals and that stirs people's emotions and that explains your group's strategies and goals to the rest of the population, right? That's necessary. But Baker said, I've always thought what is needed is the development of people who are interested not in being leaders as much as developing leadership in others. To that end, she encouraged Black Americans and their allies not just to march to protest injustice, but to organize among themselves to build autonomous, self-sustaining institutions that they could use to better their own lives and improve their communities over many years. There were no shortcuts in this system. I just don't see anything to be substituted for having people understand their position and understand their potential power and how to use it, Baker said. This can only be done, as I see it, through the long route of actually organizing people in small groups and parlaying those into larger groups. So Baker herself was not the kind of person that most Americans thought of as a leader then or today. But she inspired and taught and, yes, led a generation of civil rights organizers every bit as effectively as any of the other civil rights leaders that Americans know and celebrate. Bob Zellner, who was a white staff member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, said that the physically slight Baker was usually quiet so that you only became aware of her immense influence and wisdom gradually. She always wore a little pillbox hat like Jackie Kennedy in a suit. She had a sensible classical clothes and very few outfits. Julian Bond of SNCC found her, quote, pleasingly prim and benignly schoolmarmish, formal but not rigid, proper but not proud or arrogant. She was approachable. When Mary King of SNCC first encountered Baker, she was struck, she said, by her dignified carriage. She impressed me immediately as a person of wisdom and intellectual honesty. She appeared to me to be a sage. She was always dressed properly. She always spoke grammatically. She was very well educated, and she took pride in that. But she also prided herself on being able to connect with and communicate with people who weren't classically educated without talking down to them, which is a really interesting skill, right? She was content to listen in most situations, but when the situation demanded that she talk, she spoke with immense authority. So this is the school marm, right? The pleasingly prim school marm that Julian Bond described, right? Someone who you could approach and have a conversation with and learn from. But she had another side. The proper looks and the unassuming manner could be deceiving. Because by the time the students of SNCC knew her in the early 1960s, Baker was a militant, a radical by any definition. When she chose to, she could unsheath a sharp tongue or dominate a room with her deep, resonant voice. She'd been a champion debater in college and said, you could hear me a mile away if necessary. If you've ever heard a recording of the Texas civil rights leader Barbara Jordan, civil rights leader and politician, you have a sense of what Baker's speaking style was like when she really wanted to uncork it. She was the valedictorian and a champion debater of her college class. So she could win an argument or deliver a hell of a speech if she wanted to. All right, to get into the issues of leadership that Baker was interested in and the sorts of philosophies that she personified. I think the best way to understand that is to look at the two models of church organizing, actually, that she grew up with, and the two most important people in her life, because they explain two sides of a coin that I think will help us understand what I'm talking about when we get into issues of civil rights leadership. The two most important people in her life were her mother, Anna Ross Baker, and her mother's father, Mitchell Ross. Okay, so her mother and her grandfather. Mitchell Ross was born a slave in Littleton, North Carolina, and after emancipation, he worked hard and saved money and was able to buy a corner of the plantation he'd grown up on from the plantation owner, who was also his father. Okay? There's a lot of American history in this story. He's someone who had the reputation of being a really hard worker who also took care of his family, right? So he kept buying up more land and then using that land to help support his extended family, cousins and brothers-in-law, and a dozen or more members of the Ross family there. So you can imagine from that what his value system was like, right? The extended family lived more or less communally on this farm. They supported themselves. They took pride in supporting themselves. They built their own church on the farm. They built their own school for their kids on their farm. So these are the things that were important to them. Ross was also a Baptist preacher, and he took very seriously the notion that he needed to look after his flock, right? to lead his congregation and to take care of their needs. So that's one of the most important people of her life, and that's one of the forms of church organization that she was most familiar with, right? And she respected that, and she saw the value in it, right? There's value in having one person who's in charge of everything if he really knows what he's doing, right? If nothing else, it makes it easier to make decisions if there's only one person doing the decision making, okay? So she respected that and she saw the value in it, but she also came to consider that style a little too authoritarian. She wanted a more small, democratic style. And she developed her ideas about why institutions should be more small d democratic from her mother, Anna Ross Baker, who was active in church women's groups like the Women's Auxiliary Baptist Convention of North Carolina. She took Ella to all of her church women's meetings, right? So there as a girl, Ella Baker saw women who were capable, right? And who worked hard and who got stuff done. In thousands of different ways, they made their churches run. They made their kids' schools run. They made sure that people in their communities had the food and shelter that they needed, right? They took care of business. They made the best lives they could within the very real confines of Jim Crow. They didn't receive credit for it, but as Ella watched this, she saw them doing all the work, right? So even as a very young woman, having seen these two different models of the black church in operation, she would have asked you, who's the real leader in these communities? Right? Who is really displaying the leadership in these communities? Is it the preachers, or is it the women doing all the work? Maybe you go to a church like this, right? Is it the preacher who gives the beautiful sermon, or is it the mothers of the church who make sure everyone feels a part of the church and right? They organize the potluck and they organize everything else in the life of the church, right? Our larger society doesn't really consider that work leadership, but without it, the guy giving the sermons can't be very effective, right? So from a very early age, Ella Baker realized that this is the kind of leadership she wanted to promote, right? And that would create the kinds of institutions that she thought could change the South. So like those church women she grew up admiring at every stop along her professional journey, which began with the NAACP's national headquarters in the early 1940s and continued through the 1960s. Even as she and her colleagues battled racism, Baker had to contend with personal and institutional expressions of sexism. that underestimated or denied her abilities. She insisted that I've never been one to feel great needs in the direction of setting myself apart as a woman. I've always thought first and foremost of people as individuals. But she was, by any definition, a feminist, or at least a proto-feminist. Okay? I think that quote indicates that she didn't consider herself a feminist, but everything she did in her public life was feminist, right? Her very presence in the freedom movement and her insistence on radically democratic thought and action in all aspects of life, and especially her determination to do whatever the hell she pleased and to say whatever was on her mind without first asking permission from men who ran the organizations. I think all of these things made her especially effective as a feminist before her time. Baker's experience with the NAACP was very instructive in this regard. She graduated from Shaw University in North Carolina in 1927, as I said, the valedictorian of her class and the head of the debate team, right? Someone with real skills, and moved to Harlem, where she found it very difficult to find sustainable work. Throughout the early years of the Great Depression, she eventually got a job with the Works Progress Administration, organizing consumers, cooperatives, and became increasingly interested in and devoted to the issue of civil rights for African Americans. Right, the only game in town for someone that interested in civil rights for African Americans, and that determined to make it their life's work, the only game in town was the NAACP. And she found her way to the national offices of the NAACP in 1941, where she hired on first as a field secretary. And a field secretary in the organization was someone who went out and beat the bushes, right? The NAACP is a membership organization that depends on the dues of its members and the creation of new chapters or branches throughout the country. So in that role, Baker traveled as much as 6 months out of the year, right, on Jim Crow trains throughout the eastern seaboard and the southeast, trying to convince people in communities to start their own NAACP branch and trying to get individuals to join up and pay their membership dues. It was really unsexy, hard work, right? But she was incredibly successful at it, in part because she beat the bushes so hard. And town after town that she went to, the people who, even if they'd had an NAACP branch for years and years, they said, you're the first person from the national office who's ever actually come here to talk to us. We really appreciate that. Right? So she established these one-on-one personal relationships that she would come to consider the connective tissue of a social movement. Right? And again, there are no shortcuts around this. She did that work for about 6 years. The national leadership, especially the executive secretary of the NAACP, a man named Walter White, appreciated the work she was doing, mainly because it brought in so much money to the organization. But from her perspective, Walter White and the other men who ran the NAACP just treated the membership as an ATM machine. Right? This is the way to bring more money into the organization that's going to allow us to do the things that we want to do. Right? We'll set the priorities, and we'll use the money that comes in from the membership to hopefully accomplish those priorities. Right? Baker thought that was exactly opposite. You use the membership as a source of energy for the organization. And the way you do that is by empowering the people out in the various branches, out in the hinterlands outside of New York City, to create their own civil rights movements within their cities. Right? You allow them to determine what's important in their community. Maybe it's police brutality. Maybe it's segregation of schools. Maybe it's African American teachers being paid a fraction of what white teachers are paid in those communities. So the way to have an effective national civil rights organization, she said, was to develop the leadership that's out there in the hinterlands, right? And to empower those people to energize the NAACP, not just hit them up for money, right? There's a good example of what I'm talking about here in Dallas. Anyone know the name Juanita Craft? A couple of nods in the back. Ms. Craft was on the Dallas City Council in the 1970s 80s, I think, but way back in the 50s, she was one of the people who, Ella Baker was not directly responsible for this, but she's a good example of the kind of energy that I'm talking about, right? The NAACP would be successful, Baker said, if you had, yes, the national priorities, and you had the national office lobbying Congress and lobbying the White House for legislation to protect the rights of African Americans, right? But you need that national level, and you need that really strong grassroots presence. Juanita Craft in Dallas created the Dallas Youth Council that brought young people into the organization and really enlivened it in ways that it had never been energized before. They themselves decided that what was most important to them was the segregation of public facilities throughout Dallas. So they went and, believe it or not, African Americans used to be prohibited from the state fair except for Negro Achievement Day, one weekend of the year at the state fair, right? They thought that was wrong. They thought that devalued them, so they went and they protested at the state fair. They didn't like it that they had to buy tickets to see movies from separate ticket counters at downtown movie theaters, and then they had to go sit in a separate part of the theater. So they would hold these protests at movie theaters. One of the members of the Dallas Youth Council was named Joe Atkins, and he ended up being the plaintiff that desegregated the University of North Texas, so he's very near and dear to my heart. But this is the kind of energy on the local level that Baker was trying to promote. So she traveled throughout the South and up and down the eastern seaboard for the first 6 years of the 1940s, opening new branches. This is really important, encouraging branches to create the youth councils, like the one that Ms. Craft created here in Dallas, and again, signing up new members. After she was promoted to the position of director of branches, which is one of the 3 or 4 most important leadership positions within the NAACP's national structure, she created a program that would help her do this institutionally, right? A leadership training program that she called Give Light and the People Will Find a Way, which I think really says it all, right? Give light and people will find a way. I think that's from a hymn, so she didn't just pull that out of the air herself. But the idea is that instead of dragging people along on your path, right? Instead of setting priorities for them and asking them to follow you, you give them a light, you give them a way forward, and you let them do it themselves, right? So she created this leadership training program, and various branches could then send in applications for people that they thought had natural leadership ability from their branches, and they'd get this special training from the NAACP. This is an application that I found in the NAACP papers at the Library of Congress for one of her institutes in Atlanta. Can you make that out? I know it's hard to read. Maybe someone in the front row can see who the applicant is and blurt it out.
Rosa Parks.
Rosa L. Parks. Okay, this is for a 1946 NAACP Leadership Training Institute, 8 years before Mrs. Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Right? So these are the kind of people who Baker is trying to give the light so that they can then themselves find the way. Right? So again, this has, it's long-range planning, right? Baker's playing the long game here. It's going to be another 8 years before anyone hears of Rosa Parks, but when they do hear of Rosa Parks, she has these skills that she's gained from Baker's Training Institute, right? Another example would be the NAACP Youth Council that she insisted that the Greensboro, North Carolina branch create in the 1940s. At least one of the students who first sat in at a Greensboro lunch counter was a member of that youth group, right? So again, she's playing the long game here. During the years that Baker worked as a field secretary and the director of branches for the NAACP, the group's membership increased by 900%. And she wasn't entirely responsible for that. She wasn't solely responsible for that, but neither was she sitting around twiddling her thumbs hoping that people would join the NAACP. NAACP, right? She was out beating the bushes. So she was obviously successful at it. But she got sick and tired of the way she was treated by the male leadership of the NAACP. Even though she was one of the highest ranking officers in the organization, she wasn't consulted when the organization made long-range plans, right? Even the way that she was promoted, she thought was disrespectful to her. And so in 1946, she resigned. And for the next several years, she ran the NAACP's New York City branch, right? She ran a branch where she had the opportunity to put into practice the kinds of ideas that she had been encouraging others to put into practice. And she organized anti-school desegregation campaigns and anti-police brutality campaigns in New York City. All the while, she looked for ways to support Southern movements in whatever way she could, because she believed that the movement to end Jim Crow would have to come from the South, and it would have to be a mass movement, right? It couldn't be a movement of elites. It couldn't be a movement of just educated people who went out and argued that African Americans needed equal civil rights. It had to be a movement that pulled in people from all walks of life and allowed people with all different sorts of skills to put those skills to work for the movement, a mass movement. That's why she was so excited by the possibilities raised by the Montgomery bus boycott that Mrs. Parks touched off in 1954, and why she was willing to support the creation of the civil rights organization that grew out of it, the Southern Leadership Conference, even though she considered that organization fatally flawed from the start. Right? The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was an organization of black preachers who agreed with Martin Luther King, right? And it all but became a cult of personality around King. It certainly elevated King into a position of charismatic leadership that he was well suited for, but that she thought was not the way to go about building a mass movement, right? So she knew it was flawed, but she also thought it was the best game in town because she had already given up on the NAACP. So she's someone who's fighting for a goal, and she identifies with that goal. Anytime a group comes along that might help her reach that goal, she's willing to work with that group, but she's not loyal to the group, she's loyal to the goal. It was a bad fit. The male preachers of the SCLC simply did not like having to listen to her ideas about organizing, even though she was by far the most experienced community organizer in the whole outfit. They named her the interim executive director of the organization, and they didn't remove that qualifier for the 3 years that she served the SCLC, right? So you know what that means, interim executive director? It means you're the executive director until we can find someone better, right? That's disrespectful. They called her the interim executive director for the 3 years that she served in that role, and she kept pressing the preachers to come up with a program, right? You guys are good at giving speeches, but we need to come up with a program. And what she was really pressing them on was a way to get out and register voters throughout southern cities, which takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of organization. And they didn't necessarily excel at that kind of organization, but she kept pressing them, we need a program, we need a program. They kept showing their frustration at this woman who kept speaking up and voicing her own ideas, right? So by the spring of 1960, she was ready to quit the SCLC. She had had enough of them, they had had enough of her. But then something exciting happened when those 4 college students from North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro went and sat down at a lunch counter in the Woolworth in downtown Greensboro and announced that they were staying there until they were served. Right? Again, these guys came out of the NAACP Youth Council in Greensboro that Baker had organized 20 years before. It was a deceptively simple but a very powerful action. And it spread like wildfire. Within a few months, more than 50,000 college students throughout the country, not just in the South, but in the Northeast as well. More than 50,000 college students had participated in similar protests. The Montgomery bus boycott had been really exciting for Baker because it offered this possibility of mass action, of an entire community coming together and fighting for something. But this one was even better because it involved young people. And throughout her career, Baker always, if given the choice, threw her lot in with young people because she liked their energy. She liked the fact that they weren't cynical yet. Maybe some of you are cynical already, but most of you haven't become cynical yet, like people my age have. And she just got a lot of juice out of working with people who had that energy and that way of looking at the world, right? So the fact that this was college students not waiting for adults to tell them what to do was really exciting to her, right? They were taking the bull by the horns themselves. The SCLC's leadership instructed her to put together a conference for the students who were engaged in the sit-ins, right? Mostly from historically black colleges in the big southern cities like Nashville and Atlanta and Greensboro. They wanted Baker to pull the students together and to figure out a way to sort of rope them in under the umbrella of the SCLC. And Baker said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. She did the first thing. She organized a conference for student leaders at Shaw University, her alma mater, in April 1960. But she absolutely refused to tell them to come join the SCLC, right? Because she didn't want Martin Luther King or anyone else telling the students what to do. She explicitly, right? So this is a little dicey. She's using SCLC money to pull this conference together, but then she tells all of the attendees, don't let the SCLC tell you what to do. She said, form your own organization that's not beholden to the NAACP, that's not beholden to the SCLC. And the students agreed to do that. They created the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee later that year. And more than any other organization that Baker worked with in these 40-plus years that she devoted her life to civil rights for African Americans, more than any other organization, SNCC was true to her unique set of beliefs, which the historian Barbara Bransby describes as, quote, a philosophy based on militant anti-racism, grassroots popular democracy, a subversion of traditional class and gender hierarchies, and a long-term vision for fundamental social and economic change. I hope I made it clear that Baker's philosophy wasn't the result of armchair, academic study of social movements. It wasn't just sitting around in college classrooms talking about what it would take for a civil rights movement to come together, right? It was the result of really hard-won experience. So it's an impressive philosophy, but it's one that's based entirely on lessons that she learned from trying to be a civil rights organizer. It was radical for Baker's time, and if you take it seriously, it remains radically powerful today. Baker was an empiricist, right? She believed that bad ideas could be overcome by better ideas if they'd been formed by the gathering and analysis of evidence. And she thought that social activists, right, people who were working for social and political change, would be successful if they outworked the other side, if they gathered more evidence than the other side, right? That would help them make better arguments than the other side. She said the problem in the South is not radical thought. The problem is not even conservative thought. The problem in the South is not enough thought. So she demanded that the students who worked with her put in that work, right? They had to put in more thought than the other side. They had to come up with better arguments than the other side. They had to come up with more evidence than the supporters of the status quo. She believed that the South was able to maintain Jim Crow only because the rest of the country allowed it to. So if the Southern students could outwork and outthink the supporters of the status quo in the South, they could convince the rest of the country that it was in the rest of the country's interest to change. She had an intense intellectual curiosity. She had a genuine desire to figure out what made individual people tick, how individuals could best work en masse to improve their collective lot in life. For Baker, any social interaction was an opportunity to connect with and to learn from another human being, and those interactions formed the connective tissue of social movements. Her lifelong commitment to learning from others and to applying those lessons formed the foundation of her approach to community organizing, and those are the lessons that the students of SNCC took most to heart. They took as their motto, let the people decide, right? And their modus operandi as community organizers was to go into communities and ask people, what are the problems that you face, right? This is not the NAACP deciding in New York City, here's the priority for the next year, right? Here's the problem that we're going to try to solve. Everyone else come along with us and help us try to solve it. No, SNCC went into communities like Macomb, Mississippi, and Cleveland, Mississippi, and Albany, Georgia, and said, you know, what do you want to change? What's most important to you? How can I help you change it? Right? It's a big difference. So Baker thrived on this kind of social interaction and developed really intense relationships with the students who put her philosophy into practice. But ironically, she was also notoriously guarded when it came to her private life, and she left very little evidence of that life that would be helpful to biographers who were trying to reconstruct it, take it from one of her biographers. She didn't leave any paperwork behind, so it's really hard to figure out, for one thing, how did she pay her rent for these long years when she devoted her life to community organizing and didn't have institutional support, which was the case after she left the NAACP for several years before she joined SCLC, and then for several years after she left SCLC. Who knows? I certainly don't know. The students who worked so closely with her day to day didn't even know that she had been married for 20 years. They called her Miss Baker. Those who did know of her marriage to T.J. Roberts knew better than to ask too many questions about it, because she had a way of unleashing this face on them. Right? So the details are few and far between, even in the collection of her personal papers at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York. And based on the limited material she did leave behind, it's difficult to find answers to even basic questions about her life and livelihood. I'm sure that this was no accident or oversight on her part. Throughout her adult life, it was entirely in keeping with her modus operandi to push everything but the issues that concerned her, or the program, as she called it, that she devised to deal with them into the background. Right? Everything was about the program. Everything was about the issues. Don't waste your time on this other stuff. I tried to respect her inclination when I wrote about her, so my book ended up being an intellectual biography rather than a deeply personal history. If Baker's ideas and her lived example forced us to rethink our ideas about leadership, they've also forced us to rethink what we thought we knew about the civil rights movement. She thought of the civil rights movement as being just one part of a multi-generational freedom struggle on the part of African Americans, right? When she talked to college students, as she did anytime someone invited her to come and talk to a college class, she always began her talk with stories that her grandparents who had been born slaves told her about what life had been like during slavery, right? That's a very explicit way of connecting the student protests of the 1960s with the anti-slavery networks of the 1860s. And it was important to her to think of it in those big, long, multi-generational terms. And she thought of this big, long-lasting freedom struggle as having had two stages. The first one, she said, came with the aspect that deals with the struggle to get into the society as it obtained, or the struggle for being a part of the American scene. Right? And she saw this was an effort to integrate African Americans into American life, into American society, without necessarily changing the society. Right? You integrate into society first. That's the first phase. She said the second phase came with the struggle for a different kind of society which will reject, if necessary, the present system. The latter is the more radical struggle, right? So you integrate yourself into the system, and then you try to change the system. That's definitely the phase that she identified with most, right? Hers was definitely a radical struggle, which rejected mainstream values and replaced them with ultra-democratic, egalitarian, and even radically Christian values. Although she was raised a Baptist, as an adult, she didn't necessarily identify as a practicing Christian. She said, she practiced enough as a kid She's been to church enough times to make up for it that she didn't have to go so much as an adult. But she certainly identified with radical New Testament Christian values. This is the struggle that continues to speak to us today. Baker's radicalism demanded that Americans confront uncomfortable problems that we've yet to solve, and she made the demands in statements that were just as simple and just as profound in their own way as the current term Black Lives Matter, right? That is such a simple statement. But if you truly believe it, it forces you into some complex and radical positions, right? I think Baker is the spiritual founding parent. I almost said founding father. The spiritual founding parent of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a really interesting way that a current artist has used her words. I don't know who this artist is, but I've now seen this image several places, and I think it's so powerful. Right, this is the image of Trayvon Martin in his hoodie, with words that Ms. Baker delivered to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Convention in Jackson, Mississippi in 1964. Right? She says, until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens. Okay? That's a very simple statement that's hard to argue with. But if you take it to its logical conclusions, for us to truly live up to it would require some radical changes in American society. Right? That's just one way, though, that she continues to speak to us. So, the granddaughter of slaves who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps to become successful landowners and rock-solid pillars of their community. The daughter of hard workers who lifted as they climbed, to use the verbiage of the day, to improve the lives of their neighbors. The intellectual godmother to a new generation of social activists, and an exceptional thinker and historical actor in her own right. Baker saw herself as a participant in a saga with a long history and an unlimited future. I think what you have is a question of continuity of struggle, she said. And that struggle continues, and Baker's ideas continue to animate it. At a time when a former community organizer sits in the White House, and a time when millions of Americans identify with groups such as Black Lives Matter, or even, heaven help us, the Trump campaign, right? They don't have very much in common, but they're both trying to upend establishments, right? And they're both trying to force Americans to think about the ways our society is organized in critical ways. At a time when so many people are engaged in these kinds of grassroots challenges to the political and economic establishment and trying to bring about change, Baker's ideas regarding movement organizing and the extraordinary power of ordinary people are as timely as ever. I hope you agree with me. I hope that at least some of you have given some thought to what I talked about at the beginning and have maybe agreed with me. If you don't agree with me, at least maybe I've made you think about it. But she truly is the inventor of the American Civil Rights Movement. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I'd be happy to try to answer any you might have. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my allergies are crazy, so I hope you can understand me. Can you compare and contrast Ella Baker to Fannie Lou Hamer, like some of their similarities and differences?
So I said that Juanita Craft is one of the really good examples of the kind of people that Ms. Baker's philosophy was meant to elevate. Fannie Lou Hamer is the perfect example of that. Those of you who don't know her, Ms. Hamer was a sharecropper from Sunflower County, Mississippi, who was minding her own business, working on a plantation when 3 civil rights workers from SNCC moved into Sunflower County and started going to the local church, Williams Chapel, and asking people if they might be interested to register to vote. She had never thought of registering to vote up until 1962. And she said she listened to these guys talking, and all of a sudden she could just imagine all of these people that she could vote out of office and how much better her life would be, right? This is someone who lived a really, really hard life, had a 3rd or 4th grade education, right? At the point where she was forced to drop out and go to work to help feed her family, right? But she was just the epitome of this philosophy, let the people decide. So the snake people came in, they identified people like Mrs. Hamer. She's the very best example from Mississippi, but she's also one of hundreds of people that we could name. And they tried to help her develop her own leadership skills that she had innately, but that had never really had an opportunity to come out. And she absolutely succeeded in that. She was the chief spokesperson for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that challenged Lyndon Johnson and the so-called regular Democrats of Mississippi in 1964. Gave a really, really dramatic piece of testimony demanding that the National Democratic Party stand up for the rights of African Americans in Mississippi. So on one level, they don't have very much in common. Ms. Baker is formally educated, speaks eloquent grammatical English. Ms. Hamer doesn't, and yet she communicates absolutely as effectively as anyone else in the country, right? People know what she means when she gives a talk. So on that one surface level, they don't have very much in common. But you dig a little deeper and you see that Hamer is, again, just the epitome of the kind of philosophy that Baker had come to preach and practice by 1964. As she supported the MFDP, this is actually at the National Convention in Atlantic City, where she's giving a speech out on the boardwalk demanding that the National Party recognize the MFDP as the representatives of Mississippi. They have pictures of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, the 3 civil rights workers who've been murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi, there in the background. You can see one of them. I hope that answered your question. Yeah, they're very connected in that sense. Ms. Baker ran the Washington office that made the MFDP challenge possible. And the words from this speech are from the keynote address that she made to the state convention in Jackson. So she was very involved in this thing. Sure. Yes?
Did she have much to say about the women's movement, or connections with that, or
Surprisingly little. She certainly identified with it to a point, right? We're talking about modern, post-World War II movement, National Organization of Women and other groups like that. She certainly identified with it and didn't oppose it, but she didn't think of herself as a feminist necessarily. She's born in 1903, so she's of an older generation. And I think it's interesting because I see in her someone who definitely walked the walk of feminism and who didn't necessarily fight for her rights as a woman within these organizations and draw attention to that, but she also very conscientiously went out of her way not to ask men for permission to do anything and not to pay attention to them when they criticized her for it, right? And that's classic feminism, right? So, so she was connected to it, but not as closely as you might have suspected. Others?
I could ask one more.
Sure.
And this is about doing oral history. Because I think students, how do you go about, like you mentioned, she left very little in written form. So do we learn a lot about her by doing oral history of people she knew and just that whole, you've been involved in that a long time,
Yeah,
like students could get involved.
I relied extensively on oral history interviews that she gave in the 1970s to reconstruct her life. Someone who saved all of their bank accounts and everything else, it would be much easier to reconstruct what their life was like from the paper documents. But because she didn't leave those behind, I really had to rely extensively on the oral histories. And I'm kind of glad I did, because I was able to get I think, a much deeper sense of what her ideas really were like and where they came from than I would have otherwise. And so oral history is something that I'm obviously very interested in. I run the oral history program at UNT, and I'm also engaged in a project with 3 other historians to record what we're calling the Civil Rights in Black and Brown Project, interviews with African American and Mexican American activists throughout the state of Texas. And you're able to get to that level of understanding through that kind of research that at least I'm not able to get to through purely the paper archives, right? Although obviously I think the paper archives are important, and I try to corroborate as much as I possibly can from those 2 different sources of information. But listening to Baker talk about what the civil rights movement really was and what it was really about and what it really meant and what people's goals were as they were doing it forced me to rethink what I thought I knew about the civil rights movement. I'm trying to convey that today. I don't know how effectively I have, but it's a much more radical proposition in the way that Baker tells it, right? And had I not gotten to know her through those oral histories, I don't think I would have gotten to know that.
To kind of piggyback on that question, if she was kind of shy in talking to the media and not shy in her personality, but just steered away from that, where did you find the source of your oral histories? Is it interviews that she did maybe later in her life, or just other biographies that you may have found?
If I could push back on that just a little bit, I wouldn't call her shy. I would just say she thought it was a waste of time.
Right.
Right? And it's not the way to move the program forward. Okay? The people that she did let in and give those interviews to are people she had worked with in the 60s and who really knew what she was about, and for that reason knew the right questions to ask. And in one of the interviews, they started asking questions about her marriage. And you can't see it in the transcript, but if you know her, you can see her making this face when she said, let's not get too personal here. Let's talk about the issues, right? But I felt like I knew something on a deeper level about her than I would have if she had simply answered the question, right? I don't know if I'm engaging your question or not, but I did feel like the oral histories, because the people who were asking the questions really knew what made her tick, did allow me to get to that deeper level of understanding.
So like SNCC members would interview her?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in the case of the interview that's at the University of North Carolina's collection, that's who interviewed her. Howard University has one with a political scientist who, if he wasn't directly involved with SNCC in the 60s, he'd at least been intimately knowledgeable about what they were doing. And so they had a little bit of a history together. Yeah. All right, well, thank you again for having me. It's been fun to talk to you about Ms. Baker.
On behalf of Mountain View College, we would like to introduce Dr. Todd Moye, a gift for our as a token of our gratitude.
Thank you, Herbert.
Thank you so much.